The Church Growth and Giving Show, your resource for growing faithful communities. Brought to you by Vanco, helping tens of thousands of churches thrive for over 20 years. Join Jordan and Hannah as they share insights drawn from decades of church giving and engagement expertise.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Church Growth and Giving Show. Today, we're going to get into something that might sound, well, a little dry at first. Church sales tax exemptions. But stick with us, because this is way more interesting and impactful than you might think. And especially for you, our listeners, who are most likely knee-deep in church finances or leadership and wanting to squeeze every bit of benefit from those tax rules.
That's true. It's a topic that's kind of full of misconceptions, really. You'd kind of be surprised how many people think churches get like a total free pass, on all taxes just because they're religious organizations, but that's not how it works. Especially with sales tax, that's where things get really interesting.
Okay, so before we get too far, let's set the stage here a little. What does tax-exempt even mean when we're talking about churches?
So, at the federal level, all churches, they automatically fall under Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code. This is the big one. No federal income tax on things like offerings or donations. Churches don't even have to file that Form 990 that other nonprofits, have to worry about.
So those offering envelopes we pass around every Sunday? That money's going straight to the church's mission, not to the government. That's huge.
Exactly, it really is. And this advantage lets churches really focus those resources where they matter most. But, this automatic exemption, it only applies to federal income tax, sales tax. That's a whole different world. And that's where things can get a little tricky for churches.
Okay, hold on. Tricky how? I thought being a church that meant you were exempt from sales tax too.
It's a common assumption, but it's not that simple, unfortunately. See, sales tax exemption, it's not a federal thing. It's all up to individual states. So what we end up with is this patchwork, of rules. And it's really crucial for churches to understand how their particular state approaches this.
Ah, I see. It's not just filling out one form and you're good.
Yeah, let's take Texas as an example. They're pretty generous. They allow exemptions on most purchases that are, directly used for religious activities. So you're talking Bibles, communion supplies, even office equipment that all can be tax free.
That sounds, well, simple enough, but what if our listener is in, let's say, California? I've heard it's a bit stricter there. What's the difference?
Yeah, California takes a more nuanced approach. They allow exemptions for certain religious items, like Bibles, of course. But things like, let's say, office supplies or equipment, those might only be exempt if they're used exclusively for religious purposes. So, a computer used for both church admin and, let's say, the pastor's personal blog. That might only be partially exempt.
Wow, so even within one state, it's not always black and white. That's a level of detail I bet a lot of churches just dismissed.
You're right, and it highlights a super critical point. Assuming your exemption in one state means you're golden everywhere, that is a recipe for trouble. Imagine a church in Texas going to a conference in California. Suddenly, they could be paying sales tax on stuff they'd never pay tax on back home.
Oh, man. Talk about a budget buster. I'm seeing more and more why this deep dive is so important. It's not just about knowing the rules, it's about how they actually play out, in real life, so you're not caught by surprise.
Precisely, the devil's in the details, or I guess you could say the taxman's in the details.
All right, because it's obviously not automatic. You can't just, walk into a store, be like, hey, I'm with the church, no tax. So what do churches actually have to do?
Well, the exact process, it varies state to state, but generally it involves applying to the state's tax authority, or sometimes it's the revenue department. They usually want proof of your federal tax exempt status, so using your IRS determination letter, your articles of incorporation, and maybe even bylaws or mission statement to really prove your legitimacy.
So a bit of paperwork, but worth it, right? I mean, potentially saving thousands of dollars. What kind of impact can that have on a church's budget?
Well, the potential savings are they're significant. Studies show that churches who really use these exemptions well can boost their budget sometimes by a lot, even as much as 8.5%. Think about what your church could do with that extra money. Expanding outreach, maybe upgrading your facilities, investing in technology, a bunch of possibilities, really.
Yeah, that's a compelling reason to get this right. But it's not just about maximizing savings, right? It's also about being good stewards of the church's resources, making sure every dollar is used responsibly.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's about aligning your financial practices with your mission, right? Ensuring that you're operating in a way that's both fiscally sound and ethically responsible.
Okay, so let's flip down to brass tacks here. What kind of purchases are typically exempt for churches? Give us some real-world examples so our listener can start picturing how this applies to them.
Okay. So the general rule, it's items that are used for religious activities. So we're talking Bibles, communion wafers, candles for services. Those are pretty straightforward. But it goes further: ministry materials like books or pamphlets, office equipment like computers and printers, for church work, even outreach supplies, things like food and clothing for the needy.
So it's not just like the explicitly religious stuff, it's anything that supports the churches?
That's right. But when it comes to what they call tangible personal property, like a vehicle and furniture, things get a little more nuanced.
Oh, okay. I'm sending a butt coming here. What's the catch with the bigger purchases?
Well, the catch is that these things, they need to be used primarily for religious purposes. So take a church van as an example. If it's mainly used to transport people to services or outreach, it probably qualifies for the exemption.
But what if that van is also used to, I don't know, take the youth group to a baseball game or the choir to a concert? Does that change things?
That's where the gray areas come in. Using that van for both religious and non religious purposes. That could mean it's only partially exempt. Churches really need to keep very detailed records on how those items are being used. They've got to make sure they're playing by the rules, otherwise, they could be in for a nasty surprise during an audit.
Yikes. It's not like record keeping is non-negotiable in this world. Probably a good idea even beyond just the tax implications, right?
Detailed records, they don't just protect you during an audit, they help you track your spending, understand your patterns, and then make more informed decisions about future purchases. It's part of responsible stewardship.
Okay, so far we've talked about what's usually exempt, but let's flip the script here. Are there times when churches might actually have to pay sales tax? This is where I bet a lot of churches get tripped up.
You're right, and this is where we get to the concept of unrelated business income. This can be a bit of a minefield even for seasoned church administrators.
All right, let's carefully step into this minefield then. What exactly is unrelated business income? Why should churches be worried about it?
Well, to put it simply, it's income that a church gets from doing things that aren't really related to its main religious mission.
Mm-hmm. All right, so let's empower our listeners a bit here. What's the first thing a church should do to make sure they're handling these sales tax exemptions and this whole unrelated business income thing the right way?
The most important thing is to come up with a strong purchasing policy. Think of it like your church's official playbook, right, for buying anything. It should really clearly spell out which purchases are good for that exemption, who can actually make those purchases, and what paperwork you need.
So it's not just about knowing the rules, it's about actually having procedures in place so everybody's on the same page?
Right, a good policy, it prevents confusion, keeps things consistent, and it protects the church. You know, if they ever get audited, everybody wins.
And I imagine this is extra important for training staff and volunteers who might be handling purchases for different ministries or events, right? You don't want people just guessing.
You got it. Having a written policy, it just makes it so much easier to train everyone on what they can and can't do. When it comes to exempt purchases, it takes the guesswork out of it. And that helps create a culture of doing things by the book.
Okay, so you've got this purchasing policy all set up. What about when you actually go to make those exempt purchases? Any tips to make sure things go smoothly at the checkout?
Communication, that's key. Churches need to be really proactive about letting their vendors know about their tax exempt status. Don't just assume the vendor knows all the rules or will automatically apply that exemption for you.
So are you saying we should walk in with a big stack of documents every time we buy something? What's the best way to handle this?
The best thing is to, give your vendor a copy of your tax exemption certificate up front. A lot of states have special forms just for this, so double check what your state wants. And be really clear about what items are actually exempt. Don't be shy about asking questions and making sure everyone's on the same page before that transaction goes through.
But let's be real, mistakes happen, right? What if a church accidentally, pays sales tax on something that should have been exempt? Is all hope lost?
Not at all. Most states have ways to get refunds for sales tax if you paid it by mistake. You'll have to file a claim with the state's tax folks, and you'll need documentation to prove your case. That's where those detailed records we were talking about earlier, they really come in handy.
Okay, I think we've hammered home the importance of record keeping. Can we give our listeners some real-world tips here? What are some good ways for churches to organize all this information? We're talking receipts, invoices, exemption certificates. It's a lot.
There are a ton of options out there, both digital and, you know, good old-fashioned paper. Some churches, they stick with those traditional file systems. Some prefer spreadsheets or maybe even accounting software. The main thing is to find a system that works for your church, something that fits your size and your needs.
So there's no like one-size-fits-all magic solution.
Yeah, that's the case.
Not just that shoebox full of receipts shoved under the desk.
No, a shoebox won't cut it. Whatever system you pick, it needs to be organized, easy to access, and you gotta actually use it consistently. Otherwise, what's the point?
All right, we've covered purchasing policies, talking to vendors, record keeping. All that's super important for navigating these sales tax exemptions. But are there any other best practices churches can use to really get the most out of these benefits and avoid those potential pitfalls?
There's one strategy that can be a real game changer, especially for those bigger churches, the ones with multiple ministries or maybe different locations. It's called centralized purchasing.
What's the thinking behind that?
So instead of having, different departments or ministries all doing their own buying, everything goes through like one central hub. This streamlines the whole process, cuts down on errors, makes it easier to track those exempt purchases, and it could even give the church more power to negotiate better prices with vendors.
Sounds like a triple win. More control, fewer mistakes, and maybe even lower prices.
Exactly. Centralized purchasing. It puts someone in charge who really gets the rules, and they can make sure, everything's done the right way. It's a smart move for any church that wants to really optimize their purchasing and get the most out of those tax benefits.
Okay, you've sold me on centralized purchasing. Any other pro tips we should share before we move on?
Another one that's worth looking into, especially for smaller churches, is cooperative purchasing programs. These programs, they let churches basically team up with other organizations to get better prices from vendors. It's kind of like a group discount. You can get those lower prices on all sorts of stuff like office supplies, building materials, things like that. It's a great way to stretch your budget further.
Before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to touch on one more thing. It's a crucial one, though: seeking professional guidance. When does it make sense for a church to actually, you know, call in a tax expert? This whole conversation has made it super clear how complicated this can be.
That's a great question, and it's something every church leader should think about. A lot of churches can handle their own taxes just fine, in house. But there are definitely times when getting the experts involved is just the smartest move.
All right, so give us some specific scenarios here. When should those alarm bells be going off? When should they think about calling in reinforcements?
One common one is when a church is dealing with a really tricky tax issue, especially something that's out of the ordinary. If you're venturing into new territory, like starting a new ministry that involves making some income, or if you're not sure how a specific rule applies to you, that's a good time to reach out to an expert.
It's like getting a second opinion from a specialist before you do anything, anything big that could affect your taxes. Good advice for anybody, really, not just churches.
Absolutely, yeah. Another situation where getting professional help is really important is if the tax authorities come knocking. Having a tax expert on your side, it can make a huge difference. You know, they can help you understand the process, your rights, and they can help you present your case better. It can turn a stressful situation into something you can actually handle.
Makes sense. Dealing with the tax authorities alone is scary, especially when your church's financial health is at stake.
Yeah, and even if you think you're doing everything right, I'd still recommend talking to a tax professional every now and then, just for a checkup. They can help you stay on top of those changes in the tax laws, spot any areas where you could improve things, and make sure you're taking advantage of all the benefits that are out there.
So it's like a financial, physical for your church's taxes, a chance to catch any problems early and get expert advice on how to stay healthy.
Yeah, being proactive about your taxes, it can save you a lot of headaches and money down the line, and it lets you focus on what really matters, right? Specifically, your church's mission.
Well said. I feel like we've really cleared up a lot of the mystery around this whole sales tax exemption thing for churches. We started with the basics, then talked about practical ways to stay in compliance. We even got into some of those more advanced topics, like that unrelated business income.
Yeah, we've given our listener a good set of tools to use. But this is just the beginning. There's always more to learn when it comes to church finances.
Totally. Before we wrap up our conversation today, I was wondering if you could share any free resources that might help our listeners with sales taxes and finances.
Of course, if you check the show notes, we include a link to our free church sales tax guide where we go into detail on all things church sales tax. It's a great tool if you are looking for additional clarity on the subject.
Okay, that seems like all the time we have for today. But before we log off, please like and subscribe. It will help us to continue to build more deep dives into important topics like this one.